All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Sustaining Coastal Wetlands in a Time of Severe Storms and Rising Seas. This is the first part of a two-part series. The second part, Managing Threats to America's Beaches from Storms and Rising Seas, will take place next Wednesday, January 25th from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. I will put the link in the chat in a few minutes to register for that event if you have not already done so. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. I wanted to give a warm welcome to all of you attending today's event, and I want to thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your time. I also want to give a huge thank you to our fantastic speakers who have all put a great deal of time into preparing a great program for you all today. ELI is so thankful for your time and energy. There will be time at the end of today's event for questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You do not need to wait until the end though. Please submit the questions as soon as you think of them through Zoom's Q&A function. Should you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send me a message or email me at calhoun@eli.org. And with that, I will turn things over to our wonderful moderator, Jeff Peterson. Jeff works with the Coastal Flood Resilience Project, a coalition of organizations working to prepare for more severe storms and rising sea level along the U.S. coast. He's also the author of a New Coast Strategies for Responding to Devastating Storms and Rising Seas. I will turn things over to you, Jeff. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Madison. Welcome, everyone. Let's get right into today's webinar, Sustaining Coastal Wetlands in a Time of Severe Storms and Rising Seas. Our goal today is to provide an overview of measures and practices that will sustain coastal wetlands threatened by more severe storms and rising seas. To give everyone a common base of information about the risks that coastal wetlands face in a changing climate, we developed a read-ahead document, which you can find on the ELI webpage for the webinar. And before I introduce our panel, I want to give a quick summary of some of the key points in that read-ahead document. First, and perhaps most important, is that coastal wetlands perform valuable functions, including providing a buffer for reducing storm surges, absorbing ocean energy to minimize coastal erosion, supporting commercial and recreational fishing, providing critical habitat for birds and other species, and even sequestering carbon. There are about 6 million acres of tidal or saltwater wetlands around the U.S. coasts, and that total is gradually declining, with the greatest losses seen in the Gulf of Mexico and the Southeast. Some of these losses are due to encroachment or development, but others are the result of damage due to storms and rising sea level. In the future, as climate change drives more severe storms and sea level rise accelerates, some tidal wetlands will be overwhelmed and become open water. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration predicts average future sea level along the U.S. coast of 1.3 feet by 2050, 4 feet by 2100, and 7.2 feet by 2150 under just their intermediate scenario. The good news is that some wetlands will be able to migrate landward as sea level rises. What is dry land today will become the coastal wetland of tomorrow, and landward migration can save a wetland, but only if migration isn't blocked by human development or unfavorable natural conditions. So a key goal for the webinar today is to examine what can be done to facilitate this landward migration of tidal wetlands as we continue to protect the current wetlands that we have. In general, we'll be talking about 3 key strategies to help sustain existing tidal wetlands and support shifting these ecosystems to higher ground. First is education and planning. Broader understanding of climate change risks to coastal ecosystems is an important foundation to help sustain them. Better recognition of the risks helps to support development of plans to identify migration corridors and apply diverse measures to protect these assets in timeframes that are appropriate to the risk. Second is land acquisition and investments. Acquisition of title or easement is a key tool to protect both existing coastal wetlands and the wetlands that, and the uplands rather, that will become pathways for landward migration in response to more severe storms and rising seas. Acquisition might be by local, state, or federal governments or nonprofit organizations. And third is permits and regulations. Local, state, federal governments have a range of regulatory tools for managing wetlands and protecting landward migration pathways, and we'll explore some of those today. Ideas and innovations in these three areas are coming along well, but sea level rise is accelerating. So we're in a race to sustain existing tidal wetlands and to facilitate landward migration before the sea rushes in. We hope this webinar will help build some consensus for expanded efforts to sustain tidal wetlands for the decades ahead. I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel with deep knowledge of these challenges. Amanda Santoni is an ecologist at the Environmental Protection Agency. Specifically, she works on the Coastal Wetlands Initiative, and she leads the Interagency Coastal Wetlands Work Group, which helps to address coastal wetlands loss, management, and restoration by bringing together 7 federal agencies with programs and authorities that protect and manage coastal wetlands. Mallory Eastland is the coordinator for the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, which is part of the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability. It's an effort to improve coastal resilience and habitat protections by developing a regional salt marsh conservation plan for North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Northeast Florida. She's based out of Greenville, North Carolina. Nicole Carlozo is the section chief of the Waterfront and Resource Planning at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, where she focuses on bridging planning and implementation. She works closely with federal, state, and local partners to integrate data into decision-making for conservation and restoration efforts. She also manages the Resiliency Through Restoration Initiative, a pilot restoration program that enhances community resilience to climate change. And Emily Donahoe works with the National Wildlife Federation as a policy specialist for resilient coasts and floodplains, based out of Washington, D.C. Emily serves as a policy representative and researcher on issues related to disaster resilience, hazard mitigation, and climate change adaptation. She has a JD from the George Washington University Law School with a focus on the intersection of land use law, environmental justice, and disaster law. Today's webinar is divided into 3 sections. First, each of the panelists will give a short presentation describing their work related to sustaining coastal wetlands. Second, the panelists will respond to some general questions about options for protecting coastal wetlands in the face of more severe storms and rising seas. And third, we will take questions from the audience, and please submit your questions through the QA function. Finally, we will post the recording of the webinar and provide a link to all the webinar participants. With that, I'll give the floor to Amanda Santoni for her remarks.
Thank you, Jeff. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Santoni, and I work at the EPA Office of Water in the Ocean and Coastal Management Branch. As Jeff mentioned, my focus at EPA is on coastal wetlands, and I work on our Coastal Wetland Initiative, as well as our interagency Coastal Wetland Work Group, known as the ICWWG. I'm going to provide a very, very short overview of a recently released ICWWG document on recommendations for reducing wetland loss in coastal watersheds of the US. There's obviously much more detail in the document itself, so I'll point you towards that to learn more about specific recommendations. Just to note that these recommendations are voluntary in nature, and there's not any regulatory obligation to implement them. They span the 3 measures that Jeff mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about today, many on the planning side, as well as some on the other 2 areas that Jeff mentioned. Next slide. For the purposes of my portion of the webinar, coastal wetlands refer to all wetland types within HUC 8 watersheds that have a tidal influence and drain to the coast. This is broader than just salt marsh or tidal wetlands only, and can also include non-tidal freshwater systems, hardwood swamps, and pocosin bogs. Next slide. With that definition in mind, according to the last Status and Trends report, coastal wetlands are lost at about 80,000 acres per year, which equates to around 7 football fields every hour. Just a quick plug that the 6th National Status and Trends report, which will cover years 2009 through 2019, is due for publication soon, hopefully at the end of 2023. Next slide. In order to address these massive losses, in 2009, the ICWWG was formed with the very lofty but important goal to reduce and reverse the trend of coastal wetland loss. As Jeff mentioned, there are 7 federal agencies on the group chaired by EPA. This includes Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, Federal Highways Administration, USDA NRCS, Army Corps, and USGS. We also have several other agencies that sit in periodically. Next slide. In 2022, the EPA published the ICWWG recommendations for reducing wetland loss in coastal watersheds of the US. And this is really a culmination of work over the past 13 years of the work group, and was informed by a series of workshops and pilot studies on coastal wetland loss, seen to the right. The audience is for program managers, non-governmental organizations, and government staff, both at the federal, state, tribal, local, and regional level. And those involved in coastal wetland and watershed management. The purpose of the document is to forge cooperation across stakeholder groups and to build capacity to reduce coastal wetland losses nationwide. It's important to note that these recommendations can't be implemented and evaluated by a single agency or organization alone. So partnerships are really key for implementing these recommendations. Next slide. The recommendations are organized around 5 main themes. At this high level, these are fairly obvious, but each of the themes is further broken down into recommendations that include further potential actions. These are increasing the acreage of wetlands restored in coastal watersheds, reducing the loss of coastal wetlands to development, reducing the loss associated with silviculture in the Southeast, supporting collection of data, as well as conducting targeted outreach and stakeholder engagement. While climate and resilience are not overtly mentioned within the document, these topics are really built into the recommendations. For example, the recommendations emphasize coastal wetland protection and restoration, which can support carbon storage and reduce avoidable carbon emissions. Coastal wetland protection and restoration can also enhance climate resilience by buffering shorelines, and the recommendations call for updated and improved coastal wetland mapping, which can assist with monitoring impacts of climate change and planning for future conditions. There are over 60 recommendations, so I won't go into every single action, but in the next few slides, I will go over the secondary level, each of which has individual actions underneath. I'll be going into more detail on the recommendations at an upcoming NOM webinar next week, so tune in to that if you would like more information. Next slide. Under the restoration theme, we have very obviously increasing the amount of restoration specifically within coastal watersheds, enhancing the ability to track both restored wetland acres and function. Notably, some reporting does not currently allow for differentiation between, say, enhancement, which would not result in a wetland gain, and more of creation, which would result in a net wetland gain, as well as enhancing the restoration of former sand and gravel mines. Next slide. There are a good deal of recommendations within theme 2, which focuses on reducing losses to development. In this theme, we highlight voluntary programs, interagency coordination, a broader use of federal authorities, local planning, and enhancing state and tribal protections. Next slide. Within the silviculture theme, there is much more research and understanding to be done in this area. So a lot of the recommendations advocate for increasing understanding, coordination, and stakeholder engagement, as well as tools. Next slide. Theme 4 has to do with data, in particular improving the Fish and Wildlife Service National Wetland Inventory and NOAA Coastal Change Analysis Program data, as well as interagency coordination and improved forested wetland mapping techniques. This is a very active area of work for the ICWWG, and we have a lot of really cool interagency work going on with mapping at the moment. Next slide. This last theme is targeted outreach and stakeholder engagement. As we are creating these recommendations, we realized that all of them required aspects of outreach and stakeholder engagement in order to be successful. So rather than be repetitive, we acknowledge those important efforts in its own theme. Next slide. So that was just a very, very quick overview. Like I said, more information will be presented at the NOM webinar on January 31st from 3 to 4:30. That will include more on implementation efforts, as well as highlighting recommendations that might be best addressed by state, tribal, and local governments. So the link is on the screen. Next slide. So of course, I would also love to point you directly to the recommendations document itself. As I said, this is just a very high level overview. Much more detail and specifics are within the document. So here's both the link to the document and a QR code. Also, I think someone should be putting the link directly into the chat so it's easy to find. And my contact information is here below, so feel free to reach out. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
Great, thank you, Amanda. That was great, and that's a really comprehensive look at what the federal government can do for coastal wetlands. And I think now we'll hear for a more focused regional approach, and Mallory Eastland will talk about the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative.
Thanks, Jeff. Like Jeff said, I'm Mallory Eastland, and I'm the coordinator, aka the master cat herder for everything South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, or as we refer to it for short, SASME. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what is a salt marsh very briefly, describe some of the work SASME is doing, preview our conservation plan, which is coming out in March, and then also kind of set the stage for some of the actual work and projects we see ourselves doing post-conservation plan. So the salt marshes are coastal wetlands that are flooded and drained by tides. Super important ecological guardians. They safeguard shorelines, coastal communities, military installations from extreme storm events and impacts such as flooding. It's an extensive and iconic habitat in the Southeast. At approximately 1 million acres in the Southeast, it's nearly the size of the Grand Canyon National Park and represents a rich history, many cultures, and an irreplaceable way of life for most. Next slide. Importantly, it also serves as vital habitat for many of our nation's fish and wildlife, including those that support coastal industries and state economies. The marsh provides food, refuge, and nursery habitat for over 75% of fishery species. and it contributes to the health and resiliency of the larger landscape, which touches every living creature. So as Amanda mentioned, NOAA estimates that 80,000 acres of coastal wetlands, including salt marsh, are lost each year. As the sea levels rise, our marsh is at risk of drowning, and they're also threatened by the region's rapidly growing population. So, however, the South Atlantic salt marsh and the vital services it provides can be saved. Sustaining this resource in the face of all these persistent threats requires a concentrated effort by all those who depend on it, and this initiative is trying to do just that. Next slide. So, SASME is a regional voluntary initiative. We're voluntary, non-regulatory, and our goal is to bring together stakeholders from across the Southeast. You can see in the map here, the range of SASME goes from North Carolina down to Northeast Florida to Brevard County. We utilize our stakeholders, which include local, state, and federal leaders, academia, governmental agencies, communities, and NGOs to determine the greatest threats to the salt marsh ecosystem and opportunities for its survival in our 4-state region. So this coalition effort officially launched in May 2021, and since then, Surpass and the Pew Charitable Trust have brought together over 300 diverse partners. Our guiding principles up there at our core is partnership, being strategic and science-based. And how we built this initiative is using the conservation plan as a framework and catalyst for all the good projects and conservation to come. Next slide. So we're actually modeled after the America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative. And if you're not familiar, it's just a very successful landscape scale effort. It was used to conserve the longleaf pine from Virginia to Texas. And like I said, it's a great model for regional landscape conservation. So we've plagiarized quite a bit of their approach, and that's kind of what's helped build the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative. Obviously, salt marsh is different than the longleaf pine, but we mostly are borrowing the idea that a conservation plan can help guide decades of conservation and bring together many different states, diverse set of partners, all trying to accomplish the same goal. Next slide. So gonna bring us back to the landscape we're trying to protect. This map is just giving you a scale of where the salt marsh is, and then the map on your right is showing different models of sea level rise. So just kind of giving you an idea of what we're working to conserve, how we're trying to be proactive, and making sure that the salt marsh still exists with sea level rise, and that it has a way to migrate inland. Next slide. So this is a really quick overview of the work we've done to date to get to our conservation plan. We had a workshop about a year ago in March where we invited all of our coalition members, and the purpose of that workshop was to get the foundation of this conservation plan. And really what this image highlights is that it has been a stakeholder-driven process, and that we're trying to include the experts that work and live in the communities that we're working to save. So the workshop, all of the pre-materials were pulled together by several different teams that were made up of our really broad coalition. And then the rest of the coalition was invited to the workshop to provide feedback on what they put together. A writing team then pulled together a draft plan. And then through a couple series of review and revision, we have the final draft plan that we have now. So to date, we have all of these reviews, all feedback from a steering committee level, higher levels of leadership within Department of Defense and Department of Interior, talking to all of our partners, basically saying, you helped write this plan, you helped create this plan, can you review what we have, give us your final feedback? And then the stage we're at now is the writing team is synthesizing all of that feedback and working to update our final conservation plan. Very exciting for us, for me anyways, to be at this point. Next slide. So I'm excited to preview some of the bones of the conservation plan that will be formally debuting in March. It's organized around our main goal, which is to conserve this 1 million acres of salt marsh in the South Atlantic states for the benefit of wildlife, people, and communities. We've divided that into 3 main strategies, which boil down to conserve where what we have, where the salt marsh already is, restore the health of some degraded salt marsh, and then importantly, projecting into the future, preparing for the migration of the corridors inland. We've also identified these 4 main cross-cutting approaches that kind of touch on all of the strategies: culture and community, policy, the ever important funding, and then communication, education, and outreach. So there are proven ways to help the salt marsh and the communities that depend on it. And this plan charts a course for the conservation of the South Atlantic salt marsh, designed to ensure that the salt marsh can continue to enrich and protect the way of life. And this plan contains proven solutions that can save the salt marsh. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to galvanize and organize the 4 states so they're working interconnected to protect what is truly one interconnected landscape. These include the installation of natural and nature-based features such as oyster reefs to fortify vulnerable areas of marsh, as well as conservation of adjacent lands that can support movement of the salt marsh to areas of higher ground as sea levels rise, in a process that I've already mentioned, known as marsh migration. So a broad array of public and private stakeholders is already engaged in some efforts in the South Atlantic states. However, meeting the mounting challenges in the future requires this unified effort that we're trying to help move along. All right, next slide. So we recognize that the goal set forth in this conservation plan is ambitious and far-reaching, and the strategies necessary to achieve it will require an exponential acceleration of conservation activity and large-scale collaboration across local, state, and federal government and private partners. So SASME's broad and growing coalition is comprised of all these stakeholders and experts with a shared vision for the future health, resilience, and abundance of this 1 million acre salt marsh expanse. Our overarching challenge is to effectively communicate with, educate, and mobilize these and additional stakeholders in this coordinated effort towards implementation of the conservation plan. So our implementation portion is what we're kind of moving forward now. We have this base of our conservation plan. We have a lot of feedback. We have our important partners signed on, and we have the loose bones of implementation. But in the next year, we're really fleshing out and building out what implementation is going to look like for the next decade as we start to really work towards achieving the strategies and goals outlined in the conservation. Next slide. So this is what I think of our SASME recipe for success. And it's pretty simple when you break it down. Our greatest resource is our relationships. Partnerships has been invaluable, and we're continually building and strengthening our existing partnerships and creating new ones. Planning is the foundation. Our plan has been our concentrated focus for the past almost 2 years. And then now we're moving into the more exciting part of implementation. So this initiative is going to complement ongoing efforts and help it achieve this landscape scale conservation, one of the last vast areas of salt marsh in the US. With 1 million acres at stake, we're uniformed in our drive to marsh forward, which is also our tagline and calling card. Next slide. So that's my very quick overview of SASME, what we've done to date. A lot of the exciting projects are to come in the next 6 months to a year. So if you'd be interested in learning more or staying up to date in what's going on with SASME, please reach out to me following this webinar. You get the email below.
Great, thank you, Mallory. And with that great discussion about the regional scale look at the Southeast salt marshes, we're now turning to the state of Maryland. and their great work on protecting their coastal wetlands. And I'll hand it over to you, Nicole.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Carlozo, and I work at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And today I'll be speaking about incorporating climate change into land conservation with a focus on Maryland's wetland adaptation areas. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, Maryland is one of the more vulnerable states in the country to sea level rise. We've experienced about 1 foot of sea level rise over the past century, and we're planning for 2 additional feet by the year 2050. And coastal communities throughout the state are experiencing more sunny day or high tide flooding events and higher spring runoff, and we're expecting more extreme storm events as well. And with these threats in mind, the department recognized that we can take actions now to better prepare for and to recover from climate change impacts, both on a landscape scale and at a community level. And one means of adapting to these changes is through the preservation of the state's wetlands, which I'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. So to better understand where marshes may migrate inland with sea level rise, the department ran the Sea Level Affecting Marshes model, also known as the SLAM model, back in 2011 to predictively model long-term wetland and shoreline change expected due to sea level rise. And we modeled this for the years 2050 and 2100. And the resulting marsh migration areas were then prioritized. And we did this by looking at habitat features such as wetland diversity and marsh bird habitat. And these prioritized marsh migration areas are what we call our wetland adaptation areas, and they're here pictured here on this slide. And these are the areas that are likely to be important future wetland habitat. The medium and high priority areas shown here are what we use in our land acquisition decision-making process. Next slide, please. So DNR uses 2 tools to primarily prioritize land acquisition. The first, shown on the left, is called Greenprint, and this is an online mapper that's used to target parcels. And the green areas here are identifying the state's targeted ecological areas. And these areas were identified by looking at a number of different data sets, including our wetland adaptation areas. The second tool that we use is a scorecard. It's used to score parcels for acquisition, and that's shown on the right. And parcels that have at least 5 acres of medium or high priority wetland adaptation areas are given additional points within this scorecard system. One thing I did want to mention is that our existing state policy prevents the acquisition of parcels subject to 2 feet of sea level rise by the year 2050. So these areas have been actually removed from the targeted ecological areas, and they're not eligible for acquisition. And this decision was made to ensure that the state isn't protecting areas that will be underwater in the near future. However, these areas can be targeted for coastal resilience easements as an adaptation strategy with the goal of protecting future wetland habitat and facilitating marsh migration into the future. And I'll be talking about the coastal resilience easements later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So a number of efforts are now underway to improve the state's targeting and conservation easement process. And the first thing that we're doing is rerunning the SLAM model. This model was actually has already been rerun, and we're using that data to update our wetland adaptation areas. And this is being funded through a NOAA Ecological Effects of Sea Level Rise project. We're working with George Mason University and the Nature Conservancy to quantify the wave attenuation and flood reduction benefits of wetlands, both now and in the future as sea levels rise. So as part of this project, we reran SLAM under 6 different sea level rise scenarios. And there's a lot more to this project than just the rerun of SLAM, so I put the link to our project website on the slide if you'd like to dig into that and if you would like to get some more information about that project. Next slide, please. So the new SLAM run incorporates more recent LIDAR data and the state's most recent sea level rise projections from 2018. We update those projections every 5 years. And the projections from 2018 include values for different emissions pathways, as you could see in the second column of this table. And then also provides values representing different probabilities, as you can see in the first row of this table. And so we're modeling marsh migration and shoreline change for a variety of different planning horizons, for different emissions pathways and different probabilities. But for the statewide conservation targeting, we've zeroed in on one scenario, which I've highlighted in red on this slide, which represents a 17% probability using a growing emissions pathway. And that equates to about 1.7 feet by 2050 and 4.4 feet by 2100. Next slide, please. So this model provides decadal time steps for a variety of emission scenarios at a higher resolution than our previous run. And the maps on this slide show examples of the SLAM output for expected wetland coverage in the lower eastern shore of Maryland between 2010 and 2100 for that 17% probability scenario. So you can see the area in orange on the left representing irregularly flooded marsh, and it's transitioned by 2100 to open water. And the remaining irregularly flooded marsh area has transitioned to regularly flooded marsh, which is shown in the teal color on these maps. So these are just two examples of some of the outputs from that model run. Next slide, please. So with these data in hand, we're updating our wetland adaptation areas. We're prioritizing these areas for acquisition using a number of different factors, which are shown on this slide here. We're looking at sites where wetlands will remain up through 2100, sites where they have not transitioned to open water, and also prioritizing areas where upland is being converted to wetland. We're looking at factors like wetland size, hydric soils, areas within the state's green infrastructure hubs and corridors, and we're also looking at bird habitat. Next slide, please. So once these data are finalized, we'll be using these maps to identify parcels with at least 10 acres of upland to wetland conversion by the year 2100. And we'll be using these types of outputs to prioritize parcels for future coastal resilience easements to really focus on preserving and managing that marsh migration area. Next slide, please. So I want to use the remainder of my time to talk a little bit about the state's coastal resilience easements, and these do remain a priority strategy for Maryland to pursue wetland adaptation. Like I mentioned, parcels subject to 2 feet of sea level rise aren't eligible for acquisition, but they are eligible for resilience easements. And there are a number of provisions that were identified for these easements, which are listed here. They include development setbacks in areas subject to sea level rise by 2050, buffers to protect wetland migration areas, and impervious surface limits to limit pollution, and also optional management actions such as an expanded vegetated buffer or the installation of a living shoreline project. Maryland's first easement was actually finalized back in 2013, so it's been a while since we piloted these types of easements, and the state just completed its second pilot project in 2021. The main difference is that we added one additional element to this new project, and that was the creation of a coastal resiliency management plan. So this new element is now standard for easement agreements, and it allows us to really manage the parcel and evolve that management as climate change impacts the site over time. Next slide, please. So the coastal resiliency management plan includes a number of different factors. It includes a map that delineates the wetland adaptation buffer, which allows for that natural wetland migration. And managers consider a number of things to delineate this area, including sea level rise data, the state's wetland adaptation area data, as well as field indicators from site visits. And a number of management recommendations within the buffer have been identified, with a focus on preserving the services that the wetlands provide, both now and into the future. And I've listed some of those recommendations here, and this includes things like seeding and planting and invasive species management. But I want to mention that monitoring and research are still very much needed to help develop this guidance and to develop best practices for management of these areas. Next slide, please. So lastly, I just want to mention that the management plan is expected to be updated every 10 years to allow for monitoring and evaluation of these sites, as well as integration of new data and science-backed management strategies. But right now, policies are still needed at the state level to inform the development of these plans and the oversight of these plans, as well as the updates of these plans every 10 years. And then I just wanted to show an image here of one of our most recent easements with the wetland adaptation buffer area shown in green and the planting areas shown in those green polygons. And so this is an example of what this type of easement will look like moving forward. Next slide, please. So thank you for your time. I've listed some websites here where you can seek more information about what I covered today, or feel free to reach out to me via email, and I will turn things back over to Jeff.
Well, thank you, Nicole. That was great. And you all have really been at this for some time, and it's wonderful to hear from somebody who's had years of experience in trying to think through the issues related to coastal wetlands and particularly storms and rising seas. And now we'll go to Emily Donahoe, who is going to give us a perspective from the point of view of a major national nonprofit organization.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. It's great to be invited here and to share this space with my fellow panelists. As Jeff mentioned, I'm Emily Donahoe. I'm a policy specialist for resilient coasts and floodplains with the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm calling in today from Washington, D.C. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about sustaining coastal wetlands in a time of severe storms and rising seas. And in particular, today, I'm going to talk about the current opportunities we have with the recent influx of resources from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm also going to talk a little bit about opportunities in the federal legislative and regulatory space to protect and restore coastal environments. And I'm going to end with sharing NWF's new tool to connect communities to federal funding and technical assistance for nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So if you haven't heard about National Wildlife Federation, we are one of the oldest conservation nonprofits in the US, and NWF works to unite people to ensure that wildlife thrive in a changing world, working with our network of 52 state and territorial affiliates and 6 million members and supporters. Next slide, please. So as I briefly mentioned, there are historic once-in-a-generation levels of funding that were recently released to agencies across the federal family that can be used to invest in our coasts and to protect and restore coastal wetlands, as well as the upland areas that wetlands will migrate to as the sea levels rise. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, was signed into law in November of 2021. And this is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL, and it is a $1.2 trillion package. And this includes significant funding to protect against a number of hazards and increase the nation's resilience, which $50 billion was allocated to this bucket, including things protecting against droughts, floods, and other hazards. And in particular, I wanted to highlight two programs here, including $492 million is going to coastal infrastructure projects under NOAA's National Oceans and Coastal Security Fund, and $491 million is going to NOAA's community-based habitat restoration projects. And secondly, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, was signed into law last year in August 2022. And this includes approximately $700 billion with nearly $400 billion dedicated to climate and energy related provisions. And $3 billion of this will go to NOAA for restoring marine, estuarine, coastal, and Great Lakes habitats. So given the availability of these billions of dollars in funding to numerous agencies, this is really a critical opportunity to think creatively about how to deploy these monies across the federal family and across agencies to protect and restore coastal wetlands. And allocating and using this money well in the time frame that we have will be critically important. There's an urgency for the federal family and non-federal stakeholders to think strategically here in order to achieve large-scale benefits for our coastal habitats. Next slide, please. I also wanted to take a moment to share the current federal legislative and regulatory landscape and how recent developments and potential near-term items could assist with protecting coastal habitats and wetlands. So first on the list here is the Water Resources and Development Act of 2022, also known as WRDA. And this was enacted in late December of 2022 as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. And as a little bit of background, this bill authorizes the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer activities related to water resource management and ecosystem restoration. And so this bill will help protect communities and the environment by directing the Corps to help restore the nation's shorelines, riverbanks, and stream banks, and also allow for evaluation of flood risks when planning flood and storm damage reduction projects. And specifically, I wanted to highlight two provisions in particular, Section 8103, which will authorize the Corps to carry out projects for the protection and restoration of coastal shorelines and riverbanks, including projects that advance the conservation and restoration of natural functions and the values of rivers and shorelines. And secondly, Section 8106, which will require the Corps on request to formulate project study alternatives to maximize benefits for the reduction of flood risks, and also to maximize the net benefits for any primary purpose for water supply or water conservation purposes. So both of these provisions could be helpful in protecting these wetland migration corridors. Second on the list here, I wanted to highlight the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, or COBRA. And some brief background, COBRA was passed by Congress in 1982 to reduce development in high-risk coastal areas, protect coastal habitats, and also to save taxpayer dollars. And so COBRA was designated relatively undeveloped areas in about 3.5 million acres of coastal land along the Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, Great Lakes, US Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, as the Coastal Barrier Resources System. And the COBRA system prohibits most new federal expenditures and financial assistance within the system, which protects existing coastal wetlands and potentially their migratory paths as sea levels rise. So related to this, it was a bill called Strengthening Coastal Communities Act of 2022. And this bill was introduced in December of 2022, and it would expand the COBRA system to add coastal areas in northeastern and mid-Atlantic states. And notably, it also calls for a pilot project that would identify additional areas for inclusion within the COBRA system that are vulnerable to coastal hazards, and also areas where coastal barriers and associated habitat are likely to migrate as sea levels rise. So this expansion of the COBRA system would be critical to allow for wetland migration, and we hope to see this legislation be reinvigorated in this Congress. And the last thing I wanted to highlight here is the Federal Emergency Management Agency's FEMA's rulemaking on the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, or FFRMS. And FFRMS was established to encourage federal agencies to consider and manage current and future flood risks in order to build more resiliency. And this requires agencies to prepare for and protect federally funded buildings and projects from flood risks. So in the fall of 2021, FEMA put out a request for information on updating the FFRMS, and we are awaiting their response on that, which we really hope to see soon. And so updating and strengthening these standards could provide another avenue to allow for more migration corridors for migrating wetlands. Next slide, please. And the last thing I wanted to highlight here before my time is up is our new tool that NWF recently released. And this is the homepage if you go to fundingnaturebasedsolutions.nwf.org. Next slide, please. So this database is a tool that was created for communities seeking federal funding or technical assistance for nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. And the great thing about this tool is you can see I highlighted in the red oval here is that this database has a filters feature which allows interested entities to select their specific needs in their search for federal funding to find relevant resources for that entity's specific project in mind. So as you can see here, the filters include purpose, eligibility requirements, support type, cost sharing requirements, and federal agency. Next slide. So you can see here, this is a part of the drop-down menu for the purpose filter, and I selected, just as an example, the climate resilience and adaptation purpose and the flood/storm risk reduction purpose. Next slide. So this would be an example if you selected a number of filters, and here I clicked a couple, including local government as the eligible entity, grant funding, and needs-based for cost sharing requirements, and FEMA as the agency, and it results in these three agencies. So, or these three programs. And so it includes programs from the recent Inflation Reduction Act, as well as other federal agencies and other programs. But we just released this tool in early December 2022. So definitely looking for more feedback. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or feedback for us. Next slide, please. And my contact information is here. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion component of this panel.
Great, thank you, Emily. Thanks to all the panelists for great presentations. So in this second part of the webinar, I'll pose some questions to the panel. Each person will get a chance to respond to each question, but it's really intended to be an open discussion among the panelists. And maybe a good place to start, Emily, you mentioned the federal flood risk management standard. And I was hoping maybe if you wanted to say a little more about that, or perhaps some of the other panelists might like to comment, but it does seem like the new flood risk standard might be helpful in limiting new development, encroaching on existing tidal wetlands, and even in protecting migration corridors. So I wondered if you had any further thoughts on that.
Sure, yeah, I can speak a little bit more about it. So generally very supportive of FFRMS, but it is important to realize its current limitations and that it only right now limits development related to federal projects and funds. And so these areas are still open to development by private interests, but it generally, it does require agencies to determine specific federal building or project dimensions, like how high or wide or expansive a project or building needs to be to manage or mitigate current or potential flood risks. So it is a major step forward, and it's important and very supportive, but it also has its limits on reach. And again, other types of development, private development, can continue in these areas. So it'll take other incentives or disincentives to prevent that from occurring. And so we're very hopeful to see, or hopeful that FEMA will follow through with the RFI last fall to update the FFRMS, which could be another avenue, one tool in the toolbox to help protect migration corridors.
Does anyone else on the panel have a thought about the flood risk management standard?
Yeah, I'll just second a little bit about what Emily was articulating. I think, with migration, it's really a puzzle of how to use and leverage different authorities at different levels to help make a difference. So of course, new federal standards are going to provide, one additional layer of protection, but, I think there's still opportunities with, state and local protections and ordinances or other items that can be a different piece of the puzzle.
Right. Okay. Thinking about some of the good points you are all raising, and I think a common theme is this question of actually mapping areas for migration or landward pathways. And is there a need for some kind of national standard for mapping of tidal wetland migration corridors, or perhaps a coordinated national program to kind of do the sort of priority setting that Nicole talked about that's already underway at a state level in Maryland? Would that be useful at this point, or do we know enough yet to try and launch that kind of effort?
I can add a little insight just of issues we've run into trying to do just a regional approach to that. In our states, everyone's indifferent, and Georgia in particular has a specific mapping model that they use for funding. So we had lots of conversations with them, and it was very important and justifiably so that we not disregard the models that they use, because their funding mechanisms are based on those models, and they invest a lot of money into their SLAM models. So I've only found evidence that points to we might not be ready, and I think it would be really helpful to have a national approach to that, but it would take a lot of outreach, coordination, and sensitivity, just understanding why some states might do it differently than other states. So I'll just say from our perspective, we thought the same and then found it challenging. And then the nature of our initiative being voluntary and non-regulatory, we ultimately found it best to just incorporate what the model they were using along with the other agreed upon model that the other states were using. So that's just a little bit of an example of what we've encountered and the experiences.
Right. Other thoughts on mapping?
Yeah, I would add that I think many states are doing this kind of work already through their coastal zone management programs. And I wanted to just put a plug in for a report that just came out through the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They completed a project funded through Chesapeake Bay Trust, and it was a synthesis of shoreline, sea level rise, and marsh migration data for wetland restoration targeting. And just in that report, you can get a feel for how many different types of models are already out there to utilize. There's SLAM, INVEST, there are a number of other models, and each one is run at a different scale, has different outputs. The marsh migration areas identified by each of the tools don't necessarily overlap depending on the inputs. So it's really important to not only look at a landscape scale, but also investigate barriers and migration at the site level. So I think I would support more so ongoing research and looking at questions about marsh transition and the management of those areas. I think that could really benefit states trying to grapple with saltwater intrusion, a loss of agricultural lands, wetland loss, and really just help with determining how best to protect and enhance those migration areas.
I'd also love to jump in here and just to zoom out just slightly. One thing that we've been thinking about a lot is that we currently don't have maps that demonstrate where current natural floodplains exist in the country. period. And having those natural floodplains mapped could be a really important way to assess what we currently have or what has been deteriorated over time or developed over time or will be deteriorated or developed over time. So that's one thing. And then I also just wanted to re-highlight the opportunity with COBRA and need for an enhancement or expansion of the COBRA system to expand those migration corridors. And the pilot program that was in the bill I mentioned could be a great way to identify and map additional areas as well. So hoping to see that again.
Well, another question is that FEMA is in the process of revising its regulations governing local ordinances that are that local governments adopt as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. Would new local floodplain ordinances be a potential tool for local governments to map migration corridors as well as floodplains and to adapt or rather adopt development limits to protect areas within those corridors?
Happy to jump in, but I'd love to hear from local perspective too. But I think, again, this could just be another thing in the toolbox. Local floodplain ordinances could totally help with this problem. But again, all levels of government should be working together looking at this issue. Local governments tend to know their best interests at heart, of course, and there's a really important role here for local governments to identify and map. It could result, in a more varied outcome, which is both a strength and could also be a weakness. So looking back at the updating the FFRMS and updating that standard could be, from the federal perspective, could be a way to strengthen that too.
From an EPA perspective, we're also working with NOM to create some case studies of local wetland ordinances for state and local governments. So that might be another tool for folks at that state and local level if they don't have local wetland ordinances already or want to change some of their wetland ordinances potentially in the context of these new floodplain ordinances that are beginning to come out.
Right. Okay, one last question for the panel here, sort of as a group. There are federal regulations under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act that provide protection to existing wetlands, including tidal wetlands, but they don't actually extend to protecting landward migration corridors that are sort of future wetlands. But we do have a precedent with the Endangered Species Act that includes authority to protect both current and future critical habitat. Is there a federal role in protecting tidal migration pathways? Or should we conclude that protecting these corridors is really the principal responsibility of local and state governments and perhaps nonprofit organizations?
I guess I can start. Oh, go ahead if someone else.
You go ahead, Amanda. I'll answer after you.
Great. I think it's kind of another piece of the puzzle, as I was explaining. I think some existing federal regulations already play some type of role. For example, 404, as you mentioned, you can't have a marsh migrate if there's no marsh to begin with. So I think there are some federal roles that are already being put in place. And if you kind of think at a broader level, kind of as Emily was articulating with some of the regulations in FEMA, I'm thinking also NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, potentially grants from USDA and RCS, even, you know, guidance coming out from federal highways or, you know, assistance that they're giving to specific states for their highway modifications. They can each sort of play a different role. And I think, you know, we can use federal authorities already, maybe not to the extent that you're talking about. That being said, I think everyone's aware of the current challenges associated with regulating existing wetlands. So you could imagine the challenges at a federal level for extending those to future wetlands.
Yeah, I'll agree with what Amanda said, and I do think there's a federal role. I'll also add a little bit of our perspective of when we think particularly about like Department of Defense and protecting military mission, we have a lot of coastal installations that are going to be impacted by sea level rise. And a lot of them are trying to be proactive and are pretty engaged with SASB. Sentinel Landscapes in particular is a good example about where we're thinking federally could step in, because as the marsh migrates inland, the training grounds are also kind of migrating with that, and the loss of salt marsh impacts the military mission as well. So DoD has already recognized the importance in preparing for marsh migration. And like I said, Sentinel Landscapes looks at the installation and then looks at the surrounding landscapes and how the community is impacted and works to protect the natural resources in kind of that broader scale. So that's just another way. And kind of like Amanda mentioned, we have some of the same partners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, EPA, et cetera, engaged and recognize that there's definitely a role for them to play.
Yeah, and just to add from a Maryland perspective, you know, we sit within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we have the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, which outlines specific goals and objectives for healthy Chesapeake Bay. And this includes the creation or reestablishment of tidal wetlands. And there are I think there are 7 jurisdictions as part of that agreement. We have the Chesapeake Bay Commission and the EPA. And together we're working to evaluate how sea level rise will impact our wetland goals. So I think in some ways we're already doing this through these partnerships, federal, state, nonprofit partners working together to really identify solutions for how we can meet our wetland goals. And I think marsh migration is going to be part of that solution, whether it's tackled at a local, state, federal level. I mean, maybe all of the above, but I think a lot of the key players are already looking into this.
Yeah, I agree with all my fellow panelists and echo everything that everyone said, that you know, this is a whole of government issue, whole of government approach from all levels, and natural systems, that getting at the Endangered Species Act component that you mentioned, Jeff, natural systems that house these species also provide numerous co-benefits to communities, like cleaner water, cleaner air, recreational opportunities, hazard risk reduction benefits, and more. So ideally, everybody wants to help protect the existing habitats, and then look to you know, increase those, or increase restoration of those habitats through conservation efforts and nature-based solutions. And also wanted to highlight that the question related to the Endangered Species Act is awaiting comment from the RFI that I mentioned that FEMA put out last fall on ways to better promote conservation on threatened and endangered species and their habitats consistent with the ESA. So we'll be looking to see what they end up saying for that too.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a good discussion, and I think we got a little more insight into some of the hows of how to make this all happen. In closing this part of the webinar, I just wanted to give each panelist a chance to mention anything important that we've not discussed, or maybe any closing reflections on the biggest challenges and opportunities in this area? Strictly optional.
I'll just highlight the nature-based solutions database again, and really looking for feedback on that. So if anyone's looking for funding opportunities from federal sources to fund nature-based approaches, take a look and shoot us an email if you see something that's missing or need more information or questions. Thank you.
Okay, let's move to the final part of the webinar, and we want to open the floor to the audience for questions. Thank you. We have quite a great selection of questions to choose from, and we'll try and cover as many as we can in the remaining time. And starting here with a question essentially asking, well, okay, but what if you have a marsh that simply can't migrate because it's in front of a coastal community or is facing some other physical obstacle? What sort of management techniques are there? Asked about, for instance, thin layer deposition or ways to enhance the accretion of the marshes. What is in the toolbox for marshes where migration isn't an option?
I'll say for us, we have lots of different nature-based solutions, living shorelines, thin layer placement. Our ultimate solution isn't just everybody needs to move backwards, because that's not realistic, and that disregards a lot of communities' intrinsic attachment to the land, and it would not be environmentally just. It would be it wouldn't be equitable either, because a lot of the lower income communities are ones that live in this lower lying land. It's going to be most affected. So I just want to add that's not SASME's approach, is that like everyone needs to get back. So there's lots of different things in the toolbox. We want to utilize a lot of nature-based solutions. So I'll kind of answer that with like anything and everything, and we're hoping to continually add to that toolbox.
I second everything Mallory just said. Something that we're really investigating right now is thin layer sediment placement. And I could actually put a link in the chat to a study we did with the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, looking at different thicknesses of sediment placement and kind of the best practices for that type of approach in different regions across the US. So there's ongoing research. We're piloting that method right now in Maryland on the Eastern Shore, and a project coming up later this year. So we're going to be monitoring that. There are living shorelines, different types of restoration practices. It really depends on identifying those areas that are the most important to protect. So how do we look at all the ecosystem services of these systems to determine what are we going to let migrate on its own versus what do we want to decide is important to protect in place?
Okay, let's try another question. Actually, there are a couple of related questions. One is sort of phrased as, are you finding, as you look at either mapping or related protection questions for marsh migration pathways, a property owner reluctance or resistance, and are you finding any organized pushback to the question of, well, where is the marsh going to go, or should an upland area be used for some other purpose rather than a marsh?
I mean, I guess I could say you could tell from my presentation that we've only had 2 easements that have gone through in the last 10 years. And so there wasn't a lot of interest about 10 years ago when we developed the easement, there wasn't as much interest in that type of strategy, but we're hearing a lot more interest now as property owners are seeing the actual impacts on their properties. They're seeing more of the agricultural lands becoming too wet. And this strategy, this is basically a strategy that would allow us to prevent those marsh migration barriers from being put in place. And we can work with the property owners to make sure that they're not keeping water out, that we can allow the marsh to transition over time. So yeah, there has been, I think, there have been some challenges with implementation just from an interest level, but as folks are seeing impacts on the ground now, with all the sunny day or tidally influenced flooding, I think there are more opportunities and there's more interest.
Okay. Anyone else want to speak to the pushback resistance part of this sort of challenge here? Well, here's a question on kind of a practical problem. Has there been much experience, or have you seen cases where there's been financing, particularly, for instance, for a buyout of a property or a structure and demolition in order to make way for migration of a wetland as sea level rises?
I don't have any direct experience with that type of project, but I do believe FEMA funds projects like that. So I know that they exist in the world, in the nation, but I'm not aware of any out there.
I can speak to that a little bit. Mallory, I saw you came off mute. Do you want to go ahead? Okay. Yes, so FEMA is one agency that provides funding for a buyout of a property through a variety of programs, including the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, potentially the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, or BRIC program. And there are increasingly more federal agencies that are also providing financing for this type of work. You can absolutely use the database tool that NWF has put together to look into this further. So there should be information on that website about a variety of financing for buyouts.
And I was going to add too, no direct experience that I could point to, but as a part of pulling together our plan, we had a team that was looking at infrastructure and sustainable development that was kind of exploring the idea of those projects and funding for those projects, and potentially funding just underneath like green infrastructure, like there was underneath America's the Beautiful. So it's something that we were thinking about longer term, or even getting ahead of it a little bit and looking at infrastructure or planning infrastructure where it's not going to impact salt marsh migration and can hopefully avoid some of the heavier impacts of sea level rise on the coast.
So there's a question here. Does Maryland consider sort of combined effects of climate change and nutrient pollution on the role of essential fish habitat for finfish and shellfish in Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah, we actually have a NOAA Coastal Management Fellow right now in our office working on climate change impacts to fisheries in Maryland. So that's something that we're looking into. As I mentioned earlier, we're also a signatory onto the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So we work with many different jurisdictions from a habitat perspective, a fisheries perspective, and a water quality perspective. And as part of that effort, we're looking at considering the impacts of climate change on water quality from a nutrient loading perspective and habitat from a sea level rise perspective. So we're always looking at this issue from different lens. We look at carbon sequestration, marsh migration, fisheries, water quality. It's all interrelated.
So there's a question here from sort of a local perspective, and this person from Midcoast, Maine is looking for guidance on advising local town land use planning ordinances and revising a comprehensive plan, particularly with regard to wetland migration and housing needs. And that seems like, you know, a good time to ask the question, are there examples of local level plans, particularly, for instance, comprehensive plans that you might be aware of that you would cite as a particularly good model for someone at the local level who wanted to sort of see what other communities in comparable situations facing this question have done?
I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but I will offer that we do offer we have an annual grant solicitation, and we provide funding to local governments and municipalities to do these kinds of updates for their comprehensive plan. So if that's an issue that a jurisdiction in Maryland wanted to pursue, we could work with you on that towards an application for our grant program.
And we may be able to identify some good examples of local ordinances or comprehensive plans that speak to wetland migration that we could include in follow-up material. So we'll take that as a to-do item.
I do believe that one thing that comes to mind is Georgetown Climate Center's managed retreat toolkit. I'm not sure if that would provide any additional information for this individual in Maine, but it might be worth giving a look and checking out if there's any pieces of information that can be gleaned that are relevant to Maine.
Yes, that is an excellent tool and available online. We'll put the link for that in the follow-up materials. There is a question here directed, I think, toward Mallory, and asking if there's something similar to your sort of multi-state effort, anything like it planned or underway on the West Coast.
Not that I am aware of. I know at least when we started, what we were trying to do was kind of new. I've heard from several initiatives since then, more so on the East Coast, just kind of asking lessons learned because they're trying to do similar things within their region. But if there is something in the West Coast, I don't know of it. And if someone else does, would love if you could send that to me. But that was one of the things that SASME is hoping long-term, is that we can be a successful model for other kind of regional initiatives, salt marsh conservation or otherwise. But to my knowledge, I think what we're trying to do is still fairly new.
Okay, there's a question here. Do you know if state DOT LIDAR data would be useful in analyzing landward migration corridors for wetland habitats? LIDAR can indicate low elevation landscapes near existing wetlands that may make movement inland easier. I think that ties back to the mapping question a little bit.
I can answer. Yeah, I do think it's helpful. And we had a mapping team that was working on a like a SASME tool that's really just been used to inform this process, and not something that's well developed enough that we're marketing it broadly. But the mapping team did I have at least a map layer that looked at DOT data. So yeah, I think it was helpful, and people with far more knowledge than me in mapping identified that and incorporated into that tool.
Yeah, I would just add, there are a lot of different components that can be looked at for looking at marsh migration. So there is, looking at, are marshes actually accreting? Is there sediment available in the system to allow for accretion? Is erosion occurring? Looking at local sea level rise rates as well as elevation. So I think there are a number of different data sets that could be helpful.
Okay. Well, how about one last question here? Thinking about sort of the big picture of coastal wetlands, we have a national goal for no net loss of wetlands. Well, could there be a national goal for sustaining some part of our tidal wetlands over the long term? In the case of these tidal wetlands, might it even be possible to have a goal for a net gain?
I'll jump in here. I think stressing the importance of first protecting what we have and minimizing the loss of our current wetlands is critical, and then working to restore and increase restoration activities. And a net gain goal could absolutely be a helpful messaging tool for those types of outcomes. But in terms of actually achieving those outcomes would remain to be seen. And currently the no net loss goal has sometimes been exploited. It does provide sort of an out sometimes to allow significant wetlands impacts in one location for the promise of a wetland being restored in another location without it ever occurring, perhaps. And so a net gain goal could potentially have the same problem. So to restore these areas or to even hold steady, it would require very intentional land management to allow for the migration of tidal wetlands. And so this would mean for planning inward expansion, perhaps relocation, and not allowing for harmful engineering or hard armoring of those shoreline areas. So protecting what we have is of first importance, and then planning for what we'll lose. And then, all of that would require resources, planning, and some political will. So
I'll add too, for us, a net gain goal would has the potential to undercut some of our messaging and potentially undermine the importance of what we're trying to communicate. Just when I think of reaching out to some of our stakeholders, especially people not as involved with the salt marsh, or perhaps who don't understand how sea level rise is going to impact when we start to talk about net gain, they might be like, well, if we're gaining, then what do I have to be worried about? So that's something we think about as speaking to higher leadership. And that's just really from kind of a marketing perspective of like, it might be a nice lofty goal to have, but it doesn't communicate kind of the dire situation that we're in and the immediate need for us to concentrate, because we are at risk of losing this really valuable resource. So that's kind of one of our key messages. And I think that would be lost, or at least a little minimized, if you're thinking of a net gain goal.
Yeah, I'll second some of the complexity of this question, because, the more I ponder it, the more complex it becomes, and there might not be a simple answer. I think, as Emily put it, the intentionality of it is important. For example, in terms of coastal wetlands, many emergent wetlands have been replaced with open water, ponds, and so there might be some benefit to looking at it with a little more specificity in terms of wetland type as well. you know, and in some instances, there could even be competing interests between groups for different types of coastal wetlands or even different types of tidal wetlands. So I think it gets pretty complex, but the more intentional, you know, you can get, I think the more targeted goal can become.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. We are almost out of time, and I want to say a few closing words real quickly. First, thank you to all the panelists for great presentations and really helpful discussion. Thank you to the Environmental Law Institute for sponsoring the webinar. If you have any questions and you'd like any follow-up, you folks in the audience, feel free to email Madison or myself. We'll put our emails in the chat, and we will send by email to all the registrants a link to the webinar recording. As mentioned in the introduction, the webinar is part of a two-part series on coastal ecosystems, resilience to storms and sea level rise, and part 2 addresses beaches, marshes, and dunes, and is scheduled for January 25th at 2 o'clock. And you can find more about that on the ELI website. And then finally, thank you to all of you for joining the webinar. With that, we'll say good afternoon.
Thank you all so much. I wanted to say another big thank you from ELI. Thank you to all of our speakers and to everyone tuning in. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.